Welcome to the Veriff Voices podcast, a collection of conversations with leaders from across the industry, sharing tips and valuable insight into shaping the future of online identity. This podcast is brought to you by the people of Veriff, rebuilding trust in the digital world. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Veriff Voices, the podcast where we talk about technology, fraud, compliance, and all things related to identity verification. We have a very special episode today, actually, talking about fraud in particular, and joining me to do so is Ronnie Tokazowski. Ronnie, instead of me giving an intro to you, it's far better if you do it yourself, I think. So do you want to give us a quick intro as to who you are and your background, and then we can get some questions from there?
Thanks for having me on, first and foremost. My name is Ronnie Tokazowski. I'm a chief fraud fighter with a nonprofit called Intelligence for Good. Over the last 9 years, I've looked at many different types of fraud. I've looked at business email compromise. I've worked on romance scams, check fraud, money laundering, gift card fraud, pig butchering scams. And with a lot of the work that I've done, I've also done a lot of work both with private researchers who are tracking these things, who are working with victims, as well as collaborating with law enforcement. A lot of the reason that we do that is because this fraud across the board is like some of the highest fraud out there. There's a lot of emotional damage. There's a lot of people who are really being hurt, both financially and emotionally to this. So we try to raise awareness about how this stuff works, as well as helping give victims the resources that we can in order to talk with the right people on a lot of these things.
Awesome. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that it's a growing problem. I read a statistic this morning, actually, which said folks over here in the UK, I should say, are 20 times more likely to be the subject of fraud than they are from burglary or any other crime. So it really is a growing problem, I think. And that probably applies in all regions of the globe, I would think. I'm just curious, actually, what sort of drew you to this field in the first place? So maybe a little bit about your background and how you sort of came to this, because in some ways it's a strange career choice, but in other
Oh yeah.
ways maybe not. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my background prior to that was a lot of reverse engineering malware. So for those who know like advanced persistent threat attacks, or when different nation states are doing like attacks against each other, I was very much a reverse engineer where I was taking different malware apart. A lot of, at the time I was focusing a lot on like Chinese malware, a lot of Chinese espionage. I got hired to a company that was called Fish Me or Cofense at the time, and I was in the office, and our CFO came into the office. It was like, Ronnie, Aaron, what's going on? And he was like really, really upset. And he says, I got this email from Rohit, who was one of our founders. He said, I got this email from Rohit. They're asking me to wire money. I know it's not Rohit. They wouldn't have me wire me money. Go ahead and go figure it out. He's like, go figure out what's going on. So we looked at the email, and contrary to what we knew at the time, again, this go back like mid 2015, so many of the malware attacks were like, hey, go click this link, go click this attachment in order to infect your computer. This went outside of the norm for that. And what ended up happening was it was a conversational based attack where they were looking for engagement. They were looking for you to respond back. So at that point, we responded back to the scammers, and they actually said, yes, we're in the office. Let's go do this wire transfer. So in doing that, we built a conversation with them. We got the scammers to send us bank accounts. And that was really my first foray into this, where it was really eye-opening that, hey, this is a conversational-based attack that has no traditional malware on it. So how I got in it, it kind of like inherited me. And that's kind of how I got into it. So around 20, so towards the end of 2015, this is where business email compromise was growing at a constantly high trend. And what we ended up finding was that a lot of people were trying to track this crime. We didn't understand how it works. So I made a private mailing list that kind of works on tracking a lot of these things, and through the works and through the efforts of the mailing list, through climbing with law enforcement, banks, social media, service providers, that ended up rolling into Intelligence for Good. So it was kind of a progression of that over the years that became this nonprofit where we're continuing to help and work with the victims, because a lot of what we tracked there ends up tracking to a lot of other crimes, and we started seeing the links between all of these things. So it's a lot more complex than people realize when we try to just articulate, hey, here is the hot mess of a dumpster fire being chased by ninjas, gasoline on top, with fireworks and firecrackers, and here's how this mess actually works. So
Love it. Love it. It's a great story, and it's great to sort of hear that evolution, which in some ways
Yeah.
kind of it mirrors the evolution of online fraud as well, because it's
hmm
become more sophisticated, and people like yourselves are certainly at the front line of this. So tell us that your current job title, I believe, is chief fraud fighter, which is
Yep.
first of all one of the coolest job titles I've ever heard. Tell us a little bit about sort of intelligence for good then, and what does a day in the life of a chief fraud
Yeah.
fighter ordinarily look like?
So it usually starts off at looking at some of the worst stuff online that people don't want to look at. A lot of times we'll be looking at different things again related to like romance scams. We've been tracking a lot of things around pig butchering scams and crypto investment scams. We'll be mapping back domain infrastructure that ties back to how this stuff works. One of my colleagues, Gary Warner, who's a professor at the University of Birmingham, he has been tracking a lot of fentanyl trade. So he's been able to piece together how a lot of those illegal drugs are bought and sold online. So we've been attacking that infrastructure, and what we're calling that is we're calling it 20 targets per week.
Mm.
Where over the last 4 months, we've picked 20 targets. We've published the research on that in order for people to go ahead and start taking that down. And in addition to that, we also have people who will come forward and say, "Hey, I was a victim. Here's a case where I saw this, or this was strange. Can you help me out of this?" And we'll usually help network those people with victim advocates, or we will work with and connect them with some of the banks and financial institutions to get ahead of a lot of that. One of the really, really big articles that we did recently was we had a user come forward, again, kind of on the drug trade side. And what they said was, they said, "Hey, I'm seeing these weird ads and these weird pop-ups on this little website. You may have heard of this website before. It's called Eventbrite." So what we ended up finding was that unknown attackers were using Eventbrite to post things like, "Hey, you can go and buy your methamphetamine here. You can go and buy your fentanyl over here." And you could search it was easy. You could search for the word fentanyl, and it would bring you listings of those websites where you can go and buy those drugs. So we end up working with media to help get that taken down. Eventbrite took a lot of those things down, but that's a lot of what we do. Is we try to do that, use that intelligence for good of taking those things off of the internet, helping save people, and try to just make a difference out there.
Brilliant. I love that sort of connection to real life, as it were. I mean,
hmm
you mentioned it with the drug trade there, but we've had similar sort of stories on our side of things too, where links to things, really horrible things, human trafficking and things like that as well,
hmm
which is all tied into this. And I think that we'll get into the psychology of fraud and things a bit later on, but it does sort of talk to that piece around. I think a lot of people think fraud is fairly innocuous. It's sort of something that exists off in the ether somewhere, but the real life impacts can be quite, well, very, very damaging, can't they? And we'll certainly get into those in a moment. But let's just start talking about the technological sort of aspects of things first of all. I mean, I guess what is the role of tech in combating fraud? I think we often think of things from our side about how fraudsters are utilizing the new tech, certainly things like deepfakes and AI and that kind of those kind of softwares to try to manipulate situations. How are you countering this? What are some of the things that you're using? Some of the tools that you're finding are sort of best to help combat this stuff.
Some of the best things that we're finding is the human mind. I know that's not a technical thing, but when it comes to tracking a lot of these things, a lot of the analysts and researchers are able to be really creative on ways to help thwart this crime. So like for example, you have an attacker who's sitting there thinking all day, "Hey, how can I go and extract money from this system over here?" Likewise, you have researchers on our side who are like, "Hey, what can I do to stop these threats at scale? Or what can I do to put the biggest hurt on these attackers?" And when you start getting creative in that way, you're able to start thinking of solutions that your attackers won't be able to account for. So, like, I'll use the Alpha Bay and the Hansa takedowns as one great example of that. So, for those who are unaware, those are two drug markets that were being used to buy and sell different drugs. You could go and buy different things like stolen credit cards and information like that. So it was an all in one market. So when Alpha Bay had gotten taken down, people were posting and saying, "Hey, go over to this other market called Hansa," and they were trying to get everybody to move over there. But what they didn't know was the Dutch police had access to Hansa, and by being that creative, they actually forced all the attackers over there and were able to catch the attackers. So they essentially were able to make like this honeypot. It was like, "Oh no, we know where you guys are." So on the private side, we have to do a lot more creative things like that, of that out of the box thinking in order to understand a lot of that. Or like there's cases where we have to understand the psychology of it and understand the criminal ecosystem. Because if we can understand the criminal ecosystem, we can start predicting where some of those people are going and then take actions here in order to force that behavior. Um, Another great example, and this is going back before my time over with really digging the fraud. I was digging into some Russian malware and it was the malware family was called Dyer. And what we were doing was we were one of the first ones to publish it at the time. So what we did was we ended up finding out that the attackers were reading our blog posts. And from a threat intel perspective, knowing that someone's watching you and knowing that they're going to react within 24 hours, you can use that as a way to help influence their behavior. So we would strategically burn certain things in order to make them go one way, in order to kind of say, hey, we want to burn this thing here, but not burn this thing over here. And by having that level of psychology and that manipulation out there, you're able to help influence their behavior and realize and learn about your attackers as you do that. Where it's like, okay, they're comfortable here because they didn't do this thing, or they're comfortable here because they did that thing. So that's a lot of the ways that we're using it. And that's kind of why I go back to the human mind being the best piece of technology, is because we're able to use that technology to manipulate that behavior in order to influence how the attackers operate as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and definitely sort of echo that point. Actually, from Veriff's point of view, we obviously deal with a very sort of narrow window of potential fraud, I should say, and it's mostly around onboarding to digital services. So, are
Yep.
people presenting fake documents, or are they pretending to be someone else, and that kind of thing. And absolutely, we have our sort of AI and machine learning mechanisms in place, but you can't really beat the humans that are behind them. That sort of layer of humanity and creative thinking, as you say, because fraudsters are creative as well. They're
Oh yeah.
opportunistic, and they're always coming up with new ways of doing things. On that note, then, have you sort of seen the sort of the change in tech, I suppose, over the last? I mean, certainly the last sort of 5 years, but even maybe longer than that as well. Has that changed the face of cybersecurity as well, or are you still sort of seeing those the sort of fraudulent schemes and things that are based in more sort of traditional methods?
We see both.
Okay.
So we've seen cases where on the technology side, attackers are very heavily leaning into AI. So for example, if they're talking back and forth with like a romance scam victim, they will use an AI video with their phones stacked on top of each other. And for if you're listening to this, I have my hands in front of me, but but they've got their phone stacked to record the video from this other device here,
Yeah.
and they'll be talking. And what will be happening is the one camera will be capturing their face, and then the second camera we're playing a different face to a scam victim. And what the reason that you do that is because if you've used certain pictures to pretend that you're somebody else, you can use that same picture and kind of deep fake it, if you will, or not deep fake, but use the AI to stack it on top of each other. The second area that we've seen them improve is they're using AI to get better at writing. So in the past, it used to be like,
Yeah.
"Hey, poor grammar, don't go and do that." But a lot of it's becoming more grammatically correct. So on the technology side, that's something that we have seen. That's not like some buzzword of me trying to throw AI out. Those are actual documented cases that we have seen in regards to that. The second piece is we also have the low tech element where some of this just hasn't changed. So, in the case of engaging back and forth with a romance scam victim, these are cases where you still have somebody talking back and forth with that person. They're copy pasting messages back and forth to the victim and doing this at scale. We still know that there's a human element where you have somebody interacting with that. And pig butchering scams or the level which are also known as crypto investment scams, we see elements of a direct human conversing back and forth as well. And with many of those cases, you still have that human to human contact that's happening as a result of these attacks. So
Yeah.
that's also the low tech, not the low tech side, but the more meat powered, if you will, where it's also something where people are doing that as well.
Absolutely, and that's a good segue actually. I wanted to talk about well, pig butchery specifically, but
Yep.
I guess some of the other big sort of scams you're seeing at the moment.
Mhm.
I guess first of all, let's start by just explaining what that is, because I think it may,
Yeah.
just in case anybody's but not aware about that. So,
Oh yeah.
what does the term mean, and sort of how are these scams sort of typically executed?
Yeah, so pig butchering scams, they were originally known in Chinese as 杀猪盘, which roughly translates to pig butchering. And the way that these type of scams work is initially someone would message you, try to build a romantic relationship with you. And then from there, they would say, hey, I have this really great investment opportunity. You get like 40% return on your investment every week. Do you want to invest in that? So it was a combination and a blending of that crypto element and that romance side.
Mm.
Where many of these scams are today, it's not necessarily, you necessarily don't have that romance angle to it as much, but it's more on the cases of the crypto investment side, where people are saying, "Hey, you want to go invest in this crypto platform? Um, I have this really great insight and intelligence into how this works." The problem is that for those who are investing and those who end up getting targeted have a lot of money to invest. And the losses that we're seeing are much higher than other areas of crime. To put it into perspective, I've seen cases of $800,000. I was working with one victim who lost $1.7 million. And like I said, the losses are way higher than we've had in the past. And the problem with that is when it comes to trying to get the money back on that, a lot of the times the money is gone. Like
Mm.
I have to talk with the victim and be like, no, that $1.7 million, like I can't help. Like there's nothing that I can do in order to help get that money back. It's absolutely heartbreaking and gut wrenching in a lot of those cases. But that's a lot, again, that's a lot of the way that pig butchering works, is that crypto investment, where they'll say, hey, we have this really great platform to invest in. They might give you an app to download. They might say, hey, go to this website, and the website's going to look 100% legit. But that's mostly how that one works.
Yeah, and you kind of alluded to the potential financial
Yep.
impact there, which is really only one angle of it. Really, I think there's probably an
Mhm.
emotional toll on these folks as well, who feel
Oh,
like
yeah.
they've been ripped off and they've been lied to and everything else. It's not nice at all. And I think
Mhm.
um I think maybe the sort of the next question on this then is kind of how do you sort of approach the you mentioned it's really hard to recover money when in that sort of instance. What's the approach of insurance companies or even law enforcement when it comes to these type of crimes? Is there an openness to investigating them, or is it still a bit of there's so much of this happening, we're kind of being washed under a tidal wave here with this kind of thing?
I wouldn't say wash under a tidal wave. I would say what's something that's like 100 times bigger than a tidal
Right.
wave. And like that's not me trying to be like facetious or anything. Like
Yeah.
that's the scale we're seeing this stuff at. So it's a lot. It's way worse in that regard.
Yeah.
Specific to law enforcement's engagements, I'm trying to think how to word it. They do what they can in order to help mitigate, in order to help a lot of cases.
Mm.
And while we do have successes in getting some of this money back, there are a lot more cases where money does not come back.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the exact statistic is, but a vast majority of cases, we don't see money coming back. In addition to that, depending on which law enforcement agency is investigating this, you have certain thresholds
Hey.
that will or will not be investigated. So, for example, let's say that you have a single victim that lost $50,000. In order for law enforcement to work that and try and take that to prosecution, they have to be able to investigate it. They have to be able to identify who was the person that did that. They have to know where the money was and then try and get that money in order to get that money back.
Mm.
The problem is we have cases like earlier where we have like $1.7 million that was stolen. There's cases where you have I think there's been cases where there's been well over that. And the problem is there's no, if you have like one single victim on that, your case agent has to spend a lot of time working on that and kind of trying to piece that back together. When you have that proverbial 10 times tsunami coming with that much fraud, there are not enough investigators try, and this is like speaking right now, 2024, we don't have enough people able to investigate this stuff at the scale that we're tracking this. And we can go and we can stop some of these crimes and we can kind of get ahead of a lot of it. But the problem is there's way more fraud going on than for us to actually be able to get in order for us to impact.
Mm.
Um, so I know I kind of talked a little bit in a circle there, but hopefully it makes a little bit of sense.
It
Yeah.
absolutely does. Yeah, yeah. I think it's a really well. First of all, it's a really tricky kind of. I mean, also it's kind of the global digital economy, if you like, has made this even more complicated because it's not
Mm,
always in the jurisdiction of the where the victim is, where they're being
yeah.
investigated and that kind of thing too. So I think it's a very complex thing to look at from a
Yes.
retribution point of view.
Oh
I
yeah.
think maybe, the solution lies in the beginning in sort of preventative measures in the
Mhm.
first place, so that these
Yeah.
things never have to get to that stage where they need to be
Yeah.
investigated and so on. But um,
And also one thing
mm,
you mentioned on the retribution side of that and everything, trying to prevent it, that is something that we need to do. Like we need more prevention on that too.
yeah,
The other thing too, with where a lot of these crimes are originating, they're in places that we can't necessarily touch.
mm,
And what I mean by that is I'll use pig butchering as a great example of this. So for the people who run a lot of the pig butchering scams and everything, they are in places such as Thailand, Myanmar, slash Burma, Laos, and other places outside the United States or outside the UK, for example. The problem is a lot of those organizations are ran by criminal organizations who are involved in human trafficking. So
mm,
on the pig butchering side, a lot of the people who are pushing the buttons to scam those victims are victims themselves. And you have a lot of cases such as like criminal gangs like Triad who are involved in this and who've been involved with with different types of crime for hundreds of years. So those are some of those underlying elements that we know that are running this. And like specifically to the stuff out in Southeast Asia, we know that they're running casinos. We know that they're doing a lot of illicit activities there. Prostitution, human trafficking, organ harvesting is something that we're aware of that they've done. And the conditions that many of the people are under, like they're literally being beaten and tased. And like we have pictures from a lot of those cases where they're not being treated very well.
yeah.
So it's something where people need to realize that a lot of the people who are doing the scams, especially on the pig butchering side, are victims themselves. And again, like in the case of like Myanmar, it's the way their government is right now. It would be difficult to try and collaborate with them because of its certain involvements with their government in relation to that crime.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a very complex picture, isn't it? It's never,
Yeah.
you sort of have this blanket term of fraudsters, and you
Yeah.
assume that they're all just bad guys out there, but in actual fact, the people committing this are sometimes victims
Mm,
themselves, and
yeah.
it's part of a much bigger picture, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just on the to sort of stay on the pig butchery, let's just talk
Mhm.
a little bit around the sort of the psychological manipulation tactic that is sort of employed here.
Mhm.
What kind of tactics have you seen, I suppose? What is it that
Yeah.
people, if people are listening who may experience some of this stuff, what is it they should be looking
Yeah.
out for? Are there any sort of big watch outs or telltale signs?
Yeah, so before I go into the manipulation, are
Hmm.
you cool if I explain like a little bit of like root psychology on that to kind of help
Please
link the
do.
two together?
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
okay,
Please do.
okay. Because like I said, this is something where I've worked with a lot of victims. I've done a lot of research in this, both for myself of trying to understand things as well as for the victims. Again, this is gonna sound like completely off topic, but I promise you this is it. So as humans, we have a nervous system.
Hmm.
Our nervous system will upregulate depending on how we feel, or it will downregulate depending on how we feel. If we feel safe and if we feel like we're comfortable articulating something, our body is going to be nice and calm. Like, I don't know how you feel doing this podcast, but you probably feel a little nervous. You probably have some butterflies in your stomach. So, you, Chris, as that person on that other end, that's probably how your body feels, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, okay. So when it comes to a lot of different things like that, our nervous system, again, it will be in our sympathetic nervous system or our parasympathetic nervous system. Again, it's whether we're feeling rested and relaxed or we're feeling stressed. And when it comes to that introspection of knowing, hey, here's how the inside of our body feels, a lot of times we are either shunned to feel a certain way, or it's like, hey, you're not allowed to feel this bad thing, and you run away from that, or we'll go and we'll be super hooked on this really good feeling. We'll kind of go that way. And kind of where the rubber meets the road here with the scammers is that scammers have figured out that they can manipulate those elements, if you will.
Yeah.
So when it comes to talk about like the emotional manipulation, if you will, like you can actually take somebody who's sitting there, have those feel good hormones, kind of say, hey, you're really feeling really good, really positive about this, and you can really bring them up. You can say, "Hey, I'm going to say these really, really loving things to you. I want to be with you for the rest of my life. I want to go do this and do this and do this." And the human on the other end of that, they're going to be feeling super confident. They're going to be super happy. They're going to be super excited. They're going to be sitting there ruminating in their heads about all of these things that that person is going to be there with them. And in addition to that, when you also look at the way our consciousness works, those thoughts and those feelings are connected between our head and our bodies and everything. Now, the problem is that when it comes to the manipulation, both the body and the mind are pulled in there and they're interlinked together.
Mm.
But most of the people, most of the victims I've worked with don't realize that. And it gets to a point where if you're in a scam, you truly feel good. And we want to feel good as a side, as like things feel good. Um, but for many of the victims, they now have to come to the conclusion that okay, if they lost their money, then they have to realize that they're going to feel bad for that.
Mm.
They're going to have to feel the uncomfortable feeling of, hey, I just lost $800,000. Hey, this person no longer loves me. Hey, I don't want to go and be in this relationship or anything. This person who I was conversing with now manipulate me to the point where I'm now not talking with my family because they're yelling at me. That that emotional disconnect of feeling those uncomfortable feelings and trying to process that is really, really hard. So on the manipulation side, that's what we see is the scammers have figured out how to work with that and be able to pull that through. I believe that it's a case of correlation without causation where they don't fully understand what they're doing to the body.
Mm.
But from some of the preliminary research of digging into this, like that's the underlying root element is they're actually manipulating the emotions. Like we say, hey, they're manipulating emotions. Like many people don't really realize like how deep that goes. They don't realize that, oh, your blood pressure is now going to be up. Your organs are going to be screaming at you because you're in this horrible thing and you just want human connection. So again, that's just something most people don't realize is related back and forth to this.
Yeah, and it's remarkable too that these fraudulent organizations are able to do this at scale as well.
Mhm.
So it's not just, as you said, I mean, you think of psychology being a very individual and personal thing, but as a matter of fact, it's not the case at all. And there are
Mhm.
sort of blanket rules, I guess you can apply, and the evidence points to that too.
Yeah. And that's the thing is with like those blanket rules is because they're doing this at scale, because these cyber criminals are focused on the money,
Mm.
their goal and the kind of way that they think of it is okay, what are these steps I can do to get to my end goal of having money or having this? And because they're thinking of it in that way, they're not and they're realizing, okay, I can say this thing to me closer to that little money dot, if you will.
Yeah.
They're not accounting for that underlying emotion. Like, no, they're actually really, really hurting people. And we have many, many, many documented cases of suicide as a result of many of these types of scams out there.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine.
Mhm.
The emotional toll is almost the immeasurable part, isn't it? Sort of
Oh yeah,
financially, you can
yeah,
say we lost X amount of dollars, but the emotional
yeah,
impact is far greater in some instances. I would
yeah.
say. What can people
And I
do
will
then?
say I will say working a lot of these things
Yeah,
like that is the hardest thing. Like just again, personal growth is
I can
like
imagine.
the understanding the emotional aspect of it and seeing a lot of the pain and discomfort
Mm.
firsthand and being there crying the tears with the victims, everything on the phone. Like that is hands down some of the hardest things of working this. And like I know I struggle with that, but a lot of the people who also work with a lot of the romance scams who are working with with other victims as well, like
Mm.
that's the one thing I've heard as well is this is a very emotionally heavy thing. And that's why so many people get so upset and so frustrated about more things not being done is because many of the folks who are on the ground who are fighting this crime every single day, day in, day out, trying to make headway on this, a lot of times your organizations are not taking this as seriously as it should be.
Mm.
So like this, I'll use social media as a great example of that. We used to have a decent relationship with Facebook where we were able to kind of go and take different fake profiles down. And we, at the time, through the intelligence for good side, through some of the researchers and everything, one of the people who we were working with took over 2 million fake pages down and was solely responsible for that. And many of those came from victims that reached out to them in order to go and take a lot of that stuff down. And we eventually lost connection with Facebook and slash Meta
Mm.
because they ended up firing a lot of like their trust and safety people. So as it stands, they have a huge problem where the platform is still being used and abused by the attackers, and more things need to be done in order to get ahead of a lot of this stuff. And like again, people are really, really, really being hurt, and that's when social media needs to take more care of that. Other providers need to realize that hey, this is a huge impact, and we need to do more to help the human, if you will.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Actually, is
Yep.
kind of looking at that. we can get into a little bit later on about how individuals can look out and protect themselves and be aware
Yeah.
of this stuff. But what sort of steps can organizations be taking to ensure? Because my feeling is, and I think it's the feeling of Veriff, is that
Yeah.
customers have a duty of care to their customers. If somebody's signing
Yep.
up to a user service, and through the whole gamut of whether it's financial services all the way through to social media platforms, dating platforms, and
Yeah.
things like that too, there is a responsibility that people have with customer data, and that's enshrined in law and so on. But what about this sort of protection piece then, and things like that? Is there more that organizations could be doing to
Yep.
provide some protection here?
Yeah, so specific when I say this, there's two types of organizations. You have the organizations who have who's like a company where they'll receive the attacks in. Those companies, they do a lot. They have awareness programs, they have phishing protections. So the organizations who are seeing the attacks coming into their employees, they do a great job.
Mhm.
Now, the ones who are your service providers, your ones who are being used and abused by the attackers, they need to do more. Like Cold Stop, they need to do more. People are getting hurt. Their platforms are being abused. We know of cases of millions of accounts. Like I said, with the case of the romance scams,
Mhm.
we had over 2 million fake Facebook accounts that we had worked with Meta in order to help them shut down. But those connections were lost. They didn't want to take our data anymore and everything. It's something where the problems are still on the platform. It's still going out there. X/Twitter, another great example. You have cases where you have crypto investments that are happening through there. You can go and search for all your different it's the person who helped found the Ethereum. Like
Mhm.
if you go and search for his name, you have hundreds of different fake accounts that are out there impersonating his name. If you go to TikTok, you've got deep fake voices that are being used under Mr. Beast and Elon Musk, who are saying, "Hey, go invest in this crypto platform. Here's your website." And those deepfake videos, they're there. So those platforms are cases where like we know scams are there right now. I have personally seen them and tried to raise awareness with them inside the organizations and stuff. So with a lot of those platforms, they have to start taking this stuff seriously. I forget exactly which law it was that got passed in the United States, but it was a law that was meant to protect free speech and it was a law that was meant to protect people. However, I think organizations are misrepresenting this and misinterpreting it.
Mhm.
And essentially what the law was if someone is using your platform, you're not held liable for the content that they post. And because of that, I feel like a lot of organizations, the social medias, are kind of using that as a blanket protection, if you will, to kind of put their head under the blankets, be like, nothing's happening, la 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 la. Or like they'll go and publish and say, hey, we're doing these really great things. We are trying to put our best foot forward, but at the end of the day, the crime is still going up at an exponential curve. So we're not doing enough. We're not doing it. We're not doing the things that we need to, and we
Yeah.
have to start doing this stuff because people are truly getting hurt. People are dying and committing suicide to this,
Yeah.
and it's something where your social media providers need to understand that when it comes to working a lot of these things, because people are getting hurt, they have a responsibility to protect their customers on that platform. If I go to my bank, for example, I'm going to trust that my bank is going to do a good job and protect my money and protect my stuff on there. If they get taken advantage of, they will do their best in order to help protect me. Likewise, social media providers need to do the same thing of protecting their customers the same way. They have a name, they have a brand, they have a reputation. And unless they're doing things in order to protect people, and like they do a lot of work, don't get me wrong,
Mm.
but they're looking in the wrong places because we still know people are really getting hurt because of a lot of this.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I don't, we sort of see this certainly at Veriff as well. If you can legitimately validate who your customers are, who the people who are signing up to your service. That's a big step in the right direction. If it's linked to a government ID, if it's linked to a legitimate real life person, it does add a layer of sort of trust to the interactions you have with that person.
Mhm.
If it's a platform or for a financial services provider or whatever it is, it does help. It doesn't go all the way there, but I think that there is certainly big steps that can be made there.
Yeah.
Just putting your crystal ball in your hand for a moment, what would you sort of see the future is in this space? I should sort of think that it's from what you said so far. That it is.
And again, for those who are on the voice and everything, I am now holding
It's just
up a plastic rubber thing that is the small depiction of a vinyl dumpster fire. And if I had like 16 of these, I would be holding 16 of them up. But unfortunately, I don't have 16 arms. So yeah,
We're
my
going
official
for a tidal wave of dumpster fires. Maybe that's
yeah,
what it is.
yeah, yeah. And like I said, that's not me being joking. That's like
Yeah.
we've watched this crime go up I've seen this crime and cyber fraud go up every year for the last 9 years.
Yeah.
I started tracking this with business email compromise. We started tracking this around 500. It was trying to think. It was around $1 billion in losses. Business email compromise is now over $3 and $4 billion of losses, and we know that that specific crime links to like 16 other different types of crime. We have more awareness around things like pig butchering scams, where we know that that's constantly rising. Pig butchering scams in 2022 or 2023 had over $3 billion of fraud. So we know that these crimes are going up exponentially. The problem is with how those numbers and data are collected. We know that that is nowhere near like the true scale and scope of that. So while those numbers and metrics are like a good point, we know that from a lot of the data gaps, from a lot of the other things, that number is not 100% accurate. So when you have a number that is already bad, that is already horrible, that's already absolutely atrocious, and you know that that's not even articulating like the full scale of scope of that, we got a big freaking problem here. Again, I'll use BEC as the example of this because that's what I used to do a lot of tracking of.
Yeah.
For victims, we had victims in 146 countries across the world. And for context, we have 195 countries across the world. So that was victims in over 75% of the globe who has sent and lost different types of money related to, again, that was just business email compromise alone. We know romance scams are directly related. We know gift card frauds are related. We know a lot of other different types of fraud are directly related to that specific crime, if you will. But when you go and include other things like pig butchering scams, that's a completely separate bucket that is related, that has different types of scams. So when it comes to all of this cyber fraud, like this is a global problem here. This is a global problem where we don't know what we need to do to get ahead of a lot of that. And when you have people who are being trafficked as humans in order to go and commit a lot of these fraud, like I said, that's a big problem. We need to start doing more to understand a lot of the way that this works. So no, I 100% stick with my vital dumpster fire of it's an absolute mess right now. It's an absolute hot mess. So
Well, okay, let's what about the sort of preventative measures then, I suppose. But there's two angles for this. I think let's start with maybe the BEC first and organizations, because I think that's maybe the first layer of this. We'll get onto the pig butchering and romance scams in a moment. So what can people do? Do you have some sort of top tips that people can adhere to that will usually be kind of, keep them ahead of the game here?
Yeah. So I also just realized I never defined BEC because I've mentioned that several times. But business email compromise, a case where someone pretends to be the CEO of a company, sends an email in, says, "Hey, can you do a wire transfer for me?" And then they engage that like that. We've got cases where they may say, "Hey, I'm this employee, update my payroll for me." Go and do that. "Hey, I'm the CEO, send me some gift cards." So that's business email compromise, how that works. But from a preventative measure, this is going to sound like a very boring one. People are going to want me to say like big shiny boxes. Big shiny boxes don't work. Have that conversation with your employees and say that, hey, the CEO will never ask you for gift cards. They won't ask you to go and do this urgent wire transfer. So that's thing number one. Have open conversations with your employees. Thing number two, when it comes to creating different processes, ensure you have different layers of authority that have to sign off on the wire transfer that's going through. So who has to sign off on a $20,000 wire? Excuse me, who has to sign off on a $50,000 wire, $100,000 wire? Who is the one who's responsible for that? Don't send gift cards. And then the third thing is, and I got two more things. So for BEC, what is the sense of urgency? So a lot of times your attackers will say, hey, this is a urgent thing. You have to stop what you're doing right now and go do this thing. If there's a sense of urgency, take a step back and see, okay, is this actually me needing to do this? Or is it something where I can hold off? Again, going back to that emotional manipulation piece, they will because of that, your nervous system will be upregulated and you become more stressed and you're going to feel like you need to go and respond back to that much quicker. And then your fourth and final thing, take a look at the email, see where it's actually coming from, and make sure that it's not like some Gmail account, or when you hit the reply, if it actually looks legit, check that you reply to and make sure it's not going to a Gmail account, because attackers will modify that as well.
Okay, and let's talk about the romance scams angle then, or pig butchering. What are some steps people can take here to be vigilant and be ahead of the game?
So some of the steps for that is, and as I'm getting ready to say this, like I'm gonna have to read back my words here. But if you're trying to date somebody online, make sure that they're willing to do a video call with you, and make sure that their voice and stuff matches. The problem again, we've also got the case of deepfakes, so that piece of
Mm.
advice is something that is not as accurate as it used to be. So take that with a grain of salt, if you will. The second thing is, if you were going online dating, be very, very cautious that you're going to have a lot of feelings. You're going to have a lot of emotions going into this where you're going to want to try and build that relationship. The problem is that attackers will go and work with you for months before they may try and have you wire money. And what they'll do is they will manipulate you to the point where they'll say, "Hey, you're now in this relationship for 2.5 months. Can you go and send me $50 or
Mm.
go and send this money here?" And they will start small in order to try and get you to send that money. And then what they will do is, as the time goes on, they will say, "Oh, hey, so and so got in the hospital and they really need money in order to be saved." And why, of course, you would want to save your significant other, and you want to save their life and for this life saving surgery. So you're going to send your money, and scammers will go and tell stories like that, or they'll prey on your fear and say things like, "Hey, I am in the military and I'm stuck at this base. I'm held hostage. I need $2,000 in order to be free from my captives." So they will very much say different stories like that in order to
Right.
make you want to kind of stay in that and everything. So those are the tips for people who are in the romance scam. One of the things that I have a lot that people reach out to me a lot for too is they'll say, "Hey, I have a family member, I have a loved one, I have a friend who is involved in this. How do I help them get out?" And what those people need to realize is that the reality that that scam victim is living is a completely different perception than what is outside. So they need to understand that when talking with that person, if you go and say, "You need to get out of this, you need to do this, you need to do this," that person's going to get defensive.
Yeah.
And the reason is that's a reality that they believe is true. So if someone says and starts questioning like a deep core belief, especially when we're feeling loved, and when you threaten that, like we're going to react and we're going to get defensive on that. So when you're working with that friend and family victim, keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Be kind and be gentle. And even if they're saying things that you don't believe and that you don't know is real, to them, to that person in their head, they believe that. In addition to that, with the way emotions work, with the way our bodies work, a lot of those core memories and emotions get written to the body as well.
Mm.
So they truly believe that in their body and in their organs and stuff too. Because of that, it's something where it's a lot deeper of an issue than just, "Hey, you know this thing, you know you're wrong." It's a level of acceptance that they have to do in their body too. And there's a really good book called The Body Keeps the Score that kind of walks through the emotional trauma and the links and the correlations between, here's how our body and nervous system interacts with each other. Here's how certain experiences actually will affect how we move, how we do this, how we do this, certain tightening and tensioning of the body with your really interesting stuff that I
Mm.
was not aware of before starting a lot of this research. But that's something people need to really understand, is that there's a lot more emotionally going on.
Yeah.
And if you lead with that kindness and you lead with that empathy, and no matter how uncomfortable that situation is, for you to sit there with that person, it's 1,000 times more uncomfortable for that person, because the
Mm.
person that they're talking with is feeling vulnerable. They're feeling attacked. They don't know where to go. And within their body, they want to believe that they're actually with somebody, but they're fighting an internal battle where they're now having to come to terms with the fact that, hey, somebody wasn't there.
Yeah.
And it's very traumatizing. It's very emotionally heavy. And most people just don't know how to work through that.
And are there any sort of resources available for people if they're going through this themselves, or family members or
Yeah.
friends of theirs? Anything that you would recommend to sort of, places to start their sort of or places to find help?
Yeah, so first and foremost, start with the Internet Cybercrime and Complaint Center. I know that's a part of the FBI where you can report a lot of that stuff. So that's place number one. You also have places like the FTC. I don't know in the UK where there are different reporting bodies, but I am more than positive that
Yeah.
whichever country you are located in, because hopefully there's people from outside the US and the UK listening to this, find your respective reporting body, and then the first place where you can report. A lot of the reason for that is that's so we can track the scale and scope of this and everything. But do keep in mind that a lot of times, with the way a lot of law enforcement is working this stuff, they're still working on that empathy and that kindness piece, if you will. So do keep that in mind as well. Is that if you're part of that, that's you will run into that problem. Thing number two, it's okay to kind of talk up and say, "Hey, I was a victim in this. I was hit, and and this was a problem." That's something that is okay to do.
Yeah.
The third thing, therapy. Highly recommend therapy. Highly recommend finding somebody that you feel safe talking to on this, because with the way the manipulation works, it's a very, very complex of manipulating the consciousness. The body gets manipulated too, so you have to work with that and unpack that.
That's right.
A lot of the things that I do with a lot of victims when they're talking with me, I will usually do breathing exercises with them, because that's something that will help them down regulate their bodies and come back to a much calmer state, if you will. And the reason for that is they've been stuck in that fight or flight response for so long that their body doesn't know what calm feels like. And once your body gets back into that calmer state, it's able to start emotionally processing and healing and everything, if you will.
Yeah.
So then, and essentially, like for some of the victims I've worked with, like they can't feel anything from their neck down because of a lot of that stuff. So a lot of times it's being able to process a lot of those emotions and process those feelings in the body. Like that's what a lot of the victims need to do. And then fourth, just don't commit suicide. There is life after this. And like I said, we've seen so many documented cases where people will take their lives as a result of this and everything, but there is life after the scam. We have a lot of documented cases of people that we work with who are scam survivors who have made it through to the other side, who are some of our biggest advocates on a lot of these things to help raise awareness. So if you need somebody who's like, I have been in the same situation as you, I have experienced that conscious manipulation, I have questioned everything. Like we have people who understand those inner workings of that and who's able to work through some of that and stuff too.
Yeah, that's really good advice, and I think that's a really good point to end on. Actually, so I think it's I think well, hopefully, what we've got across today is that there is a much deeper emotional cost to all of this than just the money. I mean, as I say, just the money. Of course, there's sometimes vast sums, being lost here as well. But it's the emotional stuff that I think really hits home for us. And I think one of the missions of Veriff is to try to sort of return a bit of trust to the internet, and this is a big thing that we're trying to one of our missions, and trying to place those very sort of small steps in the way to do so. So, but Ronnie, this has been a really, really insightful conversation. So thank you. First of all, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. And hopefully we can check in again on the future about how things are going and where we are from there.
Yep, sounds good. Hopefully we can start putting out this fire.
We can reduce that tidal wave. Yes, that's very much.
Yeah.
All right, Ronnie, all the best. Thank you.
Yep, take care.
This podcast is brought to you by Veriff. Identity verification made simple. Learn more at veriff.com.